Thomas Hartwell had served the royal family for 37 years, standing guard in the shadows of Buckingham Palace. His weathered hands trembled as he held the letter that would change everything. The Queen had been gone for months now, and the weight of her final secret pressed heavily on his conscience. It was a cold October morning when Thomas first noticed the young man lingering near the palace gates. The stranger had striking blue eyes and a familiar jawline that made Thomas's heart skip a beat. Day after day, the man returned, always carrying fresh flowers and standing quietly for exactly 20 minutes before walking away. Thomas recognized something in those features that haunted him. The same eyes that had looked at him during those secret midnight meetings 43 years ago. The same gentle smile that belonged to the late Queen during her younger years. This couldn't be a coincidence. The Royal Guard's mind raced back to 1979, when he was just a young officer assigned to the Queen's personal security detail. He remembered the hushed conversations, the private car rides to a small cottage in the countryside, and the woman who lived there with her newborn son. The Queen had made him swear an oath of silence that he had kept for decades. Margaret Thornfield was a kind schoolteacher who had caught the Queen's attention during a charity visit. Their friendship had blossomed into something deeper, something that could never be made public. When Margaret became pregnant, the Queen had quietly arranged for her care and support, visiting whenever she could slip away from royal duties. The baby boy, named David, had grown up believing his father was a traveling businessman who had died when he was young. Margaret never told him the truth, even on her deathbed 5 years ago. The only people who knew were the Queen, Thomas, and the palace doctor who had delivered the child in secret. Thomas watched the young man at the gates again, noting how he moved with an unconscious grace that seemed almost royal. The flowers he brought were always the same variety, white roses mixed with lavender, the Queen's personal favorite combination that few people knew about. His duty as a royal guard was to protect the monarchy, but his conscience as a human being told him that David deserved to know who he really was. The Queen's final letter, sealed and given to Thomas just days before her passing, contained instructions that had kept him awake for months. The letter revealed that the Queen had been watching David from afar his entire life. She had anonymously funded his education, ensured his mother received excellent medical care, and even helped him secure his first job at a London museum. She had loved him deeply but could never acknowledge him publicly. Thomas knew that revealing this secret could shake the very foundations of the royal family. The media would have a feeding frenzy, and David's quiet life would be destroyed forever. But the Queen's final wish was clear. If anything happened to her, Thomas was to find David and give him a smaller sealed envelope that contained a personal message from his mother. The Royal Guard had spent sleepless nights wrestling with this decision. He had seen firsthand how the public scrutiny had affected other members of the royal family. David seemed happy and peaceful, working as a curator and living a simple life in his small London flat. Did he have the right to turn that world upside down? As Thomas watched David place the flowers near the palace gates once more, he noticed something that made his decision for him. The young man pulled out a small photograph from his pocket, a picture of the Queen from a magazine, and whispered something to it before kissing it gently. The love and longing in that simple gesture broke Thomas's heart. David had been searching for something his whole life without knowing what it was. The way he stared at the palace with such deep emotion suggested that somewhere in his heart, he felt a connection he couldn't explain. Margaret must have told him something, or perhaps he had always sensed that his story was incomplete. Thomas made his choice. The next morning, he would approach David and honor the Queen's final request. The secret had been buried long enough, and a son deserved to know his mother's love, even if it came after her death. The Royal Guard straightened his shoulders and prepared to change 2 lives forever. David Morrison had always felt different, though he could never put his finger on why. Growing up in the quiet village of Hartford with his mother Margaret, he had been a curious child who asked too many questions about his father. His mother's answers were always vague, filled with gentle smiles and quick changes of subject. The morning Thomas approached him outside the palace gates, David was placing his usual bouquet of white roses and lavender. He had been making this pilgrimage every week since his mother's death, drawn by a feeling he couldn't understand. Something about the palace called to him, as if he belonged there in some small way. Thomas appeared beside him like a shadow, his Royal Guard uniform pristine despite his obvious nervousness. David had noticed the older man watching him over the past few weeks but assumed he was just doing his security job. When Thomas spoke his name, David's world tilted slightly off its axis. The Royal Guard's voice was gentle but firm as he introduced himself and asked if David would join him for coffee at a nearby cafe. Something in Thomas's eyes, a mixture of sadness and determination, made David nod without question. They walked in silence to a small establishment that Thomas clearly knew well, where the owner greeted him warmly and gave them a private corner table. Thomas pulled out an envelope with David's name written in elegant handwriting. The paper was expensive, the kind used for important documents, and it bore a small royal seal that made David's hands shake as he reached for it. Before opening it, Thomas told him about Margaret and the Queen's secret friendship that had lasted for over 4 decades. The story unfolded like something from a fairy tale, except it was real and it was about his life. Thomas spoke carefully, watching David's face for signs of shock or disbelief. He explained how the Queen had met Margaret during a charity visit to the local school where she taught, how their friendship had grown into love, and how David had been born from that impossible relationship. David listened in stunned silence, as Thomas revealed that his mother had kept detailed journals about her relationship with the Queen. After Margaret's death, she had left instructions for these journals to be given to Thomas, along with a letter for David that she had been too afraid to deliver herself. Inside the envelope was a handwritten note from the Queen, dated just weeks before her death. The words were simple but filled with a mother's love that had been hidden for 43 years. She wrote about watching him grow up from afar, about being proud of his achievements, and about the pain of never being able to hold him or call him her son. The Queen had included a small locket that contained a tiny photograph of herself holding David as a newborn baby. On the back was engraved, "To my beloved son, with all my love always, Elizabeth." David stared at the image, seeing his own eyes reflected in the woman who had been his mother and the monarch of an entire nation. Thomas continued his story, revealing how the Queen had secretly supported David throughout his life. The scholarship he had received for university, the recommendation that had gotten him his job at the British Museum, even the small inheritance that had allowed him to buy his flat. All of it had come from the Queen's personal funds, channeled through various charities and organizations. David's mind reeled as pieces of his life suddenly made sense. The mysterious benefactor who had always seemed to appear when he needed help most, the way certain doors had opened for him when they should have remained closed, the feeling that someone was watching over him, protecting him from life's harshest realities. The young man thought about his mother Margaret, remembering how she would sometimes stare at the television during royal broadcasts with tears in her eyes, how she had collected newspaper clippings about the Queen's activities and kept them in a special box, how she had insisted on teaching David about British history and the importance of service to others. Thomas handed him a second envelope, this one containing Margaret's final letter to her son. In it, she apologized for keeping the truth from him, but explained that she had wanted to protect both David and the Queen from the scandal that would have erupted if their relationship had been discovered. She had loved them both too much to risk destroying their lives. As David processed this life-changing information, Thomas gently explained the complexities of the situation. David was not in the line of succession because his parents had never been married, and the relationship had been kept completely secret. He had no legal claim to any royal titles or privileges, but he was undeniably the Queen's son by blood. The weight of this revelation settled on David's shoulders like a heavy cloak. Everything he thought he knew about himself was suddenly different. The quiet museum curator who had lived an ordinary life was actually the secret son of the most famous woman in the world. Thomas gave him a final piece of information that would change everything again. The Queen had left specific instructions about what should happen next, and David would need to make some difficult decisions about whether he wanted to step into the light or remain in the shadows where he had always lived. The royal family was in complete chaos. Princess Catherine had noticed something strange during the reading of the Queen's will, when the family solicitor mentioned a sealed addendum that was to be opened only in the presence of Thomas Hartwell. The document had remained untouched for months while Thomas wrestled with his conscience. But now the time had come. King Charles sat in his private study at Clarence House, his face pale as Thomas stood before him with the Queen's final revelation. The new monarch had always known his mother kept secrets, but this one threatened to rewrite the history of their family. The existence of a half-brother he had never known about was almost impossible to process. Thomas presented the evidence carefully: Margaret's journals, photographs of the Queen's secret visits, medical records from a private clinic, and most damning of all, a DNA sample that the Queen had secretly obtained years earlier through a discarded coffee cup from David's workplace. The results were unmistakable. David Morrison was indeed the son of Queen Elizabeth II. Prince William entered the room as Thomas finished his explanation, his face a mixture of shock and protective concern for his father. The heir to the throne had always been close to his grandmother, but this revelation showed him that even he hadn't known the full depth of her private life. The implications for the monarchy were staggering. The Queen's letter to her family, read aloud by Thomas, was both an apology and a plea for understanding. She explained how her relationship with Margaret had given her the greatest joy and the greatest pain of her life. She had watched David grow into a good man from afar, proud of his achievements but heartbroken that she could never acknowledge him publicly. Charles struggled with conflicting emotions as he learned about his half-brother. Part of him felt betrayed that his mother had kept such a monumental secret, while another part admired her sacrifice and the love that had driven her to protect both David and the monarchy. The weight of deciding what to do next fell squarely on his shoulders as the new king. Princess Anne arrived within the hour, her practical nature immediately focused on the potential consequences of this revelation. She had always been the most direct of the Queen's children, and she asked the hard questions that everyone else was thinking. What did David want? How much did he know about royal protocol? Could he be trusted to keep this quiet if they asked him to? Thomas revealed that David was still processing the information and had not made any demands or requests. The young man seemed more interested in understanding his mother's love than in claiming any royal privileges. However, Thomas warned them that David was an intelligent person who would eventually want to know more about his heritage and his place in the family. The discussion that followed was intense and emotional. Prince Edward arrived last, having driven through the night from Scotland, and his quiet presence added another voice to the family debate. Each sibling had different concerns and different ideas about how to handle the situation. Charles, worried about the impact on the monarchy's reputation and the media storm that would follow if David's existence became public knowledge. William was concerned about his own children and how this news would affect their understanding of their family history. Anne wanted to know if there were any other secrets they needed to prepare for. The Queen's letter included specific requests for how David should be treated. She wanted him to be welcomed into the family if he chose to step forward, but she also wanted his privacy protected if he preferred to remain anonymous. She had set aside a substantial trust fund for him and requested that he be given the opportunity to learn about his royal heritage. Thomas presented them with copies of Margaret's journals, which painted a beautiful but heartbreaking picture of a love affair that had lasted for decades. The Queen had visited whenever she could, had celebrated David's birthdays through cards sent anonymously, and had grieved when she couldn't attend his school graduations or other important moments. The family learned that David had inherited more than just the Queen's eyes. He had her love of history, her gentle manner with people, and her sense of duty to others. His work at the British Museum involved preserving historical artifacts, and he had unknowingly been protecting pieces of his own family's legacy. As the evening wore on, the royal family faced the reality that their carefully managed world was about to change forever. They had always dealt with public scrutiny, but this was different. This was about accepting a new family member whose very existence challenged everything the public thought they knew about the late Queen. Thomas shared one final detail that would influence their decision. David had been asking questions about his father his entire life, and recently, after his mother's death, he had begun researching his family history more seriously. It was only a matter of time before he uncovered some of the truth on his own. The weight of the Queen's final secret now rested with her children, and they had to decide whether to honor her wishes or protect the monarchy from a scandal that could change the course of British royal history forever. David Morrison's life had become a whirlwind of emotions and revelations that he struggled to process. 3 days had passed since Thomas had delivered the life-changing news, and David found himself unable to concentrate on his work at the British Museum. Every artifact he handled seemed to whisper stories of royal history that now included his own bloodline. His small London flat, once a peaceful sanctuary, now felt cramped and inadequate as he spread out the photographs, letters, and documents that Thomas had given him. The evidence of his mother's secret life was overwhelming. Pictures of the Queen visiting his childhood home, letters written in royal stationery, and most shocking of all, images of himself as a baby being held by the woman the world knew as their monarch. The hardest part was reading his mother Margaret's journals, which revealed the depth of her love affair with the Queen and the constant pain of keeping their relationship hidden. Margaret had written about watching royal broadcasts and seeing the woman she loved performing her duties while hiding her true feelings. She had documented every secret visit, every stolen moment, and every heartbreak when duty called the Queen away. David discovered that his mother had been much more than just a village school teacher. The Queen had quietly arranged for Margaret to receive advanced education opportunities, and she had become an expert in British literature and history. Their shared intellectual interest had deepened their bond beyond the physical attraction that had first brought them together. The young man found himself studying his reflection in the mirror, looking for traces of his royal heritage. The blue eyes that had always seemed unusual in his family now made perfect sense. The way he naturally carried himself, the unconscious habits that his mother had always said made him seem distinguished, all of it suddenly had an explanation. Thomas had given him a private phone, number, and instructions to call when he was ready to take the next step. The royal guard had explained that the family knew about his existence now and wanted to meet him, but the decision about how to proceed had to be David's. The weight of that choice was crushing. David thought about his job at the museum, where he specialized in preserving royal artifacts and historical documents. The irony wasn't lost on him that he had spent years carefully maintaining pieces of his own family's history, without knowing his connection to them. His colleagues had always teased him about his encyclopedic knowledge of royal genealogy and his reverent handling of anything connected to the monarchy. The revelation had also explained some of the mysterious events in his life. The scholarship that had appeared just when his mother couldn't afford university tuition. The job recommendation that had come from nowhere when he was struggling to find work. The small inheritance from an anonymous benefactor that had allowed him to buy his flat. All of it had been his mother, the Queen, watching over him from a distance. He remembered conversations with his mother Margaret about duty and service to others. She had always emphasized the importance of using whatever privileges you had to help those less fortunate. Now he understood that she had been preparing him for the possibility that he might someday learn about his royal heritage and the responsibilities that could come with it. David's phone had been ringing constantly with calls from his few close friends who were worried about his sudden absence from work and social activities. He had told his supervisor at the museum that he was dealing with a family emergency, which was technically true, though he couldn't explain that the family in question was the British royal family. The young man found himself drawn back to Buckingham Palace, but now his daily visits felt different. He was no longer an outsider looking in. He was a son returning to a home he had never known was his. The guards at the gate seemed to watch him with new interest, and he wondered if word had spread about his identity. Thomas had warned him about the media attention that would follow if his story became public. The British press would dig into every aspect of his life, and his quiet existence would be destroyed forever. Photos of him would appear on front pages around the world, and he would never again be able to walk down the street without being recognized. But there was also the possibility of finding the family connection he had always felt was missing from his life. The chance to understand where he came from and to honor the mother who had loved him enough to sacrifice her own happiness for his protection. The opportunity to carry forward the legacy of service that both his mothers had, embodied in their different ways. David pulled out the locket the Queen had left for him and stared at the tiny photograph of himself as a newborn in her arms. The love in her eyes was unmistakable, and he could see the same gentle expression that his mother Margaret had always worn when she looked at him. 2 women had loved him completely, and now he had to decide how to honor that love. The phone number Thomas had given him sat on his kitchen table like a bridge between his old life and whatever came next. One phone call would set events in motion that could never be undone. David Morrison, the quiet museum curator, would cease to exist, and someone new would have to take his place. As the sun set over London, David made his decision. He picked up the phone and dialed the number, knowing that his life was about to change forever. The meeting took place at Highgrove House, King Charles's private residence in Gloucestershire, away from the prying eyes of the London media. David arrived in a simple taxi, carrying only a small bag containing the letters and photographs that Thomas had given him. His hands trembled as he approached the front door of a home that belonged to his half-brother. King Charles himself answered the door, and for a moment, both men simply stared at each other in silence. The family resemblance was subtle but unmistakable, something in the set of their shoulders and the thoughtful expression in their eyes. Charles had prepared himself for this meeting, but seeing his mother's secret son in person was still a shock that left him momentarily speechless. The king led David into a comfortable sitting room, where Princess Anne and Prince Edward were waiting. Prince William had chosen not to attend the first meeting, wanting to protect his young children from the complexity of the situation until the family decided how to move forward. The atmosphere was tense but not unfriendly, filled with the awkwardness of family members meeting for the first time as adults. Princess Anne, ever practical, took the lead in the conversation. She asked David direct questions about his life, his work, and his intentions now that he knew the truth about his parentage. Her tone was not unkind, but it was clear that she was evaluating whether David could be trusted with the family's most dangerous secret. David spoke honestly about his confusion and the overwhelming nature of the revelations. He assured them that he had no interest in claiming royal titles or privileges, but he admitted that he wanted to understand his heritage and learn about the mother he had never known. His sincerity and obvious intelligence began to ease the tension in the room. Prince Edward, the most artistic of the Queen's children, was fascinated by David's work at the British Museum. They discovered a shared love of history and preservation that created an immediate connection. Edward saw in David the same careful attention to detail and respect for tradition that had defined their mother's approach to her royal duties. King Charles shared stories about the Queen's private moments, painting a picture of a woman who had struggled with the constraints of her position while trying to follow her heart. He revealed that their mother had often spoken about duty versus personal happiness, though he had never understood the full context of those conversations until now. The family showed David through the house, pointing out family photographs and heirlooms that now had new meaning for him. In the Queen's private study, which Charles had left untouched since her death, they found additional evidence of her secret life. Hidden in her personal desk were more photographs of David at various ages, clearly taken from a distance by someone watching over him. David learned that the Queen had attended his university graduation, sitting in the back of the auditorium disguised behind dark glasses and a simple headscarf. She had watched him receive his degree in history, and had been present for one of the most important moments of his life without him ever knowing. The revelation brought tears to his eyes and helped heal some of the pain of growing up without knowing his father. The conversation turned to practical matters as the afternoon progressed. The royal family's private secretary arrived to discuss the legal and constitutional implications of David's existence. While he had no claim to succession, his acknowledgement by the family would require careful handling to avoid constitutional crises or media disasters. David was surprised to learn about the trust fund that the Queen had established for him, which contained enough money to ensure his financial security for life. More importantly, she had left instructions that he should be given access to royal historians and genealogists who could help him understand his place in the family's complex history. The family discussed the possibility of David taking on some unofficial role within the royal household, perhaps working with the royal collection or helping with historical research. His expertise with museum artifacts and his natural discretion made him an ideal candidate for behind-the-scenes work that would allow him to contribute without public exposure. As evening approached, the conversation became more personal. Charles spoke about the pressure of royal duty and the sacrifices that came with public service. Anne shared stories about growing up in the public eye and the challenges of maintaining privacy. Edward talked about finding ways to pursue personal interests while fulfilling royal obligations. David began to understand that being part of the royal family wasn't the fairy tale that the public imagined. It was a life of constant scrutiny, endless duty, and personal sacrifices that most people couldn't comprehend. His mother, the Queen, had protected him from all of that by keeping his existence secret. But now he had to decide whether he wanted to step into that world. The meeting concluded with an invitation for David to stay at Highgrove for a few days to continue getting to know his family and to decide how he wanted to proceed. Charles offered him the use of a guest cottage on the property where he could have privacy while still being close enough for continued conversations. As David settled into the cottage that evening, he reflected on the surreal experience of discovering that he belonged to the most famous family in Britain. The quiet museum curator who had lived an ordinary life was slowly transforming into someone who might have a role in preserving and protecting the monarchy that his mother had served so faithfully. The next few days would determine not just David's future, but potentially the future of the royal family itself. The Queen's final secret was no longer hidden, and now everyone involved had to decide how to honor her memory while protecting the institution she had devoted her life to serving. The British media was beginning to sense that something unusual was happening within the royal family. Reporters had noticed increased security around Highgrove House and the presence of several royal cars at what should have been a quiet weekend retreat. The palace press office was fielding more questions than usual. Though they maintained their standard policy of not commenting on private family matters, David had been staying at Highgrove for 5 days, and each conversation with his newly discovered family revealed more about the complex world he had inherited. Prince William had finally agreed to meet him, bringing Princess Catherine along for what would be one of the most delicate family introductions in recent royal history. The future king and his wife approached the meeting with careful diplomacy, understanding that David's existence could potentially complicate their children's inheritance and the public's perception of the monarchy. However, William was also curious about this uncle he had never known, and Catherine's natural warmth helped ease the tension that surrounded the gathering. David found William to be surprisingly down-to-earth, despite his position as heir to the throne. They discovered shared interests in conservation and historical preservation, and William was impressed by David's thoughtful approach to his newfound royal heritage. Catherine appreciated David's obvious respect for privacy and his genuine concern about not causing problems for the family. The conversation with William and Catherine revealed another layer of complexity to David's situation. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, were roughly the same age that David had been when the Queen began her secret support of his life. The parallel wasn't lost on anyone, and it raised questions about how much the next generation should know about their family's hidden history. During his stay at Highgrove, David had been working with the royal librarian to research his mother's relationship with the Queen through official records and private correspondence. The depth of their connection became even more apparent as he uncovered decades of carefully hidden evidence of their love affair and the Queen's involvement in his upbringing. Thomas Hartwell visited again to provide additional documents that the Queen had entrusted to him over the years. Among them was a series of letters that the Queen had written to David but never sent, chronicling her thoughts and feelings as she watched him grow up from a distance. Reading her words of pride in his achievements and her regret at not being able to be present for important moments was both healing and heartbreaking for David. The royal family's advisors had been working around the clock to develop strategies for managing David's existence. Whether they decided to acknowledge him publicly or keep his identity secret, the constitutional implications were minimal since he was not in line for succession, but the public relations challenges were enormous. King Charles had been having private conversations with the Archbishop of Canterbury and other senior clergy about the religious and moral aspects of his mother's relationship with Margaret. While times had changed significantly since the 1970s, the revelation that the Queen had maintained a same-sex relationship while married could still shock many traditional supporters of the monarchy. David learned that his existence wasn't the only secret the Queen had kept. The royal family had a long history of hidden relationships, unofficial children, and carefully managed scandals that had been kept from public view. His situation was unusual but not unprecedented, and there were established protocols for handling such delicate matters. The young man had also been introduced to the Queen's former private secretary, who had been one of the few people aware of the relationship with Margaret. She provided additional context about how the Queen had balanced her public duties with her private happiness, and how the strain of keeping such a significant secret had affected her over the years. As David spent more time with his newfound family, he began to understand the enormous responsibility that came with royal blood. Every decision had consequences that extended far beyond personal preferences, and the weight of tradition and public expectation was constant and overwhelming. The family had begun discussing practical arrangements for David's future involvement with royal activities. They proposed that he could work quietly with the royal collection, helping to catalog and preserve historical artifacts without any public acknowledgement of his relationship to the family. This would allow him to contribute meaningfully while maintaining the privacy that everyone agreed was essential. However, David was struggling with the moral implications of keeping his identity secret forever. He felt that denying his connection to the Queen was somehow dishonoring her memory and the love she had shown him throughout his life. The internal conflict between protecting the monarchy and honoring his mother was becoming increasingly difficult to resolve. The situation became more complicated when David's former colleagues at the British Museum began asking questions about his extended absence. His supervisor had called Highgrove House directly, trying to reach him about an important exhibition that required his expertise. The call had been handled diplomatically, but it highlighted how difficult it would be to maintain his double life indefinitely. As the week progressed, pressure mounted from various directions. The media was becoming more persistent in their inquiries about unusual royal family activities. Palace security had detected photographers using long-range lenses to capture images of David walking in the Highgrove Gardens. Most critically, there were signs that someone with knowledge of the Queen's secret was considering approaching the press with information. The royal family faced an impossible choice: acknowledge David publicly and deal with the resulting media storm, or find a way to keep him hidden while managing the growing suspicion that something significant was being concealed. Either path carried enormous risks for both David and the monarchy, and time was running out to make a decision that would shape the future of the British royal family. The decision came suddenly when a tabloid journalist contacted Buckingham Palace, claiming to have photographs of David at Highgrove House and demanding comment on rumors about a secret royal family member. The palace press office immediately alerted King Charles, who knew that their window for controlling the narrative was rapidly closing. David Morrison sat in the same comfortable sitting room where he had first met his royal siblings, but this time the atmosphere was charged with urgency. The family had gathered for an emergency meeting to decide how to handle the media crisis that was about to explode around them. Everyone understood that their next decision would change British royal history forever. King Charles spoke first, outlining their options with the calm authority that came from years of dealing with public crises. They could deny everything and hope the story would fade away, but the evidence was too strong and the journalists seemed determined to pursue the story. Alternatively, they could take control of the narrative by announcing David's existence on their own terms. Princess Anne argued for a carefully managed disclosure that would acknowledge David while emphasizing his desire for privacy and his lack of any claim to royal titles or duties. Prince Edward supported this approach, suggesting that David's expertise in historical preservation could be positioned as a natural fit for unofficial royal work. Prince William, however, expressed concerns about the impact on his children and the precedent this would set for future royal secrets. He worried that acknowledging David would encourage more digging into the family's private affairs and could destabilize the monarchy during a critical period of transition after the Queen's death. David listened to the debate about his future with growing clarity about what he wanted. The past week with his newfound family had been enlightening, but it had also shown him how constrained and artificial royal life could be. He had seen the careful calculations behind every public appearance and the constant pressure to maintain an image that might not reflect reality. Thomas Hartwell, who had been present for this final family meeting, reminded everyone of the Queen's specific wishes as outlined in her sealed letter. She had wanted David to have the choice of acknowledgement or anonymity, but she had also expressed hope that he would find a way to honor both his heritage and his desire for a normal life. The breakthrough came when David himself spoke up, proposing a solution that surprised everyone. He suggested that they acknowledge his existence publicly, but frame it as a historical revelation rather than a current royal story. They could position it as the final chapter in the Queen's legacy, emphasizing her compassion and her complex human nature rather than treating it as a scandal. David's proposal involved working with respected royal historians and biographers to tell the story accurately and sympathetically, rather than letting tabloid journalists control the narrative. The family could cooperate with serious historians to create an authoritative account that would become the definitive version of events. This approach would allow David to honor his mother's memory while maintaining most of his privacy. He would be acknowledged as the Queen's son, but he would not take on any official royal duties or titles. His work with historical preservation could continue, perhaps with a slightly more prominent role in protecting royal artifacts and documenting family history. The family agreed to David's proposal, recognizing its wisdom and maturity. King Charles was particularly impressed by his half-brother's understanding of both the personal and institutional challenges they faced. The solution honored the Queen's memory while protecting the monarchy's stability and David's right to a relatively normal life. Over the following weeks, the announcement was carefully orchestrated with the help of respected royal correspondents and historians. The story was presented as a touching revelation about the late Queen's private life and her capacity for love beyond the constraints of her public role. David was portrayed as a dedicated historian who had unknowingly spent his career preserving his own family's legacy. The public reaction was surprisingly positive. Many people were moved by the story of the Queen's secret love and her lifelong care for a son she could never publicly acknowledge. David's obvious intelligence and discretion, combined with his lack of interest in royal privileges, made him a sympathetic figure rather than a threat to the monarchy. David Morrison returned to his work at the British Museum, but with a new understanding of his place in history and his responsibility to preserve the stories of those who came before him. He established a private foundation, funded by his royal inheritance, to support historical research and preservation projects. Thomas Hartwell finally retired from royal service, knowing that he had fulfilled his final duty to the Queen by ensuring that her son found his place in the family and the world. The old guard's conscience was clear, and he could rest knowing that love had ultimately triumphed over secrecy. The Queen's final secret had been revealed, but rather than damaging the monarchy, it had humanized it. The story of Elizabeth the Queen and Elizabeth the Mother showed the world that even the most duty-bound public figures were complex. Human beings capable of great love and great sacrifice. David found peace in knowing that both his mothers had loved him completely and had made difficult choices to protect him. He carried forward their legacy of service and discretion, working quietly behind the scenes to preserve the history and traditions that connected past, present, and future generations of the royal family and the British people they served.